Hello, I'm Dr. Philip Wandawa, and today we are going to continue with our series on the book of Ephesians. We've been walking through these books, myself and other preachers, and we started with a grand vision at the beginning of chapter 1, talked about salvation in chapter 2, how God changes us and saves and forgives us, a new identity as a people of God, in the family of God, members of the family of God in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, we talked about the church and the gifts God has given to equip the church. Today we are in chapter 5, and we're going to talk specifically about marriage and the family. Paul has moved his attention from the church in general, from the ministries God has given the church, and is focusing on the family. One of the outcomes of the gospel is that it transforms every segment of society, including the family. And I would like for us to read our text, which is Ephesians chapter 5 from verse 22. I'm going to begin from verse 21 to the end of that chapter. And verse 21 of chapter 5 says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, which he is the Savior, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." There is little doubt today that marriage is in crisis. It is in the news, it is on our networks, social networks, some of the jokes, some of the stories, many of the stories about broken homes or broken relationships or unfaithfulness. And I think one of the things at the center of all these stories is that there is an overwhelming quest today for self-fulfillment, self-actualization, personal happiness, and personal preferences. They are the drivers that are shaping relationships, including marriage. Therefore, it means that since personal happiness, personal self-expression has such a high premium, it means that includes sexual self-expression, freedom, which means being faithful to one's partner is no longer a top priority or a value, which something people put values on. It could be career, one's career, what one wants to do, especially if it is earning money. So we're in an environment where it's become normal. Being faithful to your wife or to your partner is kind of like going the extra mile. If you sleep around, if you have hookups, one-night stands or one-week stands or one-month stands, or a side dish, those have become acceptable. And more recently, as we begin to pay the price for that type of behavior or the way we are treating our relationships, people are realizing that probably the children they have may not be theirs, maybe from a different father, especially, of course, regarding women are the ones who normally, of course, take care of the children. And this is the DNA testing is now even threatening to break up the family. And we are all struggling to find answers. There are no easy answers. The government is actually preparing some legislation to protect the children. We shall see how that comes along. In other words, there is no doubt that the family is in crisis. This passage that we are reading today, that we just read today, Ephesians chapter 5 from verse 21 to the end, gives us probably the main way in which you can begin to address, to regain balance about family, about marriage. It is a calling to a high view of marriage. I want to suggest to you that one of the problems that we're facing today is we have a low view of marriage, a functional view of marriage. Marriage as something we do out of biological necessity. I need somebody to have sex with. I need somebody to take care of my home. I also have to have children so that I'll have somebody who will inherit or an heir. Cultural obligations are kind of some of the big reasons why people get married. Or it could be social standing. You've got to be seen to have, to be, a married man or a married woman. But those views, those are not the highest views of marriage. This text gives it to us. And one of the things that comes out very clearly is that marriage has its origin in God. Paul makes an analogy showing that marriage relationship is like the marriage is Jesus' relationship with the church. And out of that, he starts to give us some pointers. The beginning in God, it means that husband and wife, a man and a woman, begin on equal ground. They're both creatures in God. They're both called to this vocation. This is a vocation that God himself created. So the man and the woman have obligations to God primarily. It's not just a sociological thing or a cultural institution that although of course it exists in culture, it is something that God started. We begin with a high view. So do you see yourself as a husband or as a wife that actually you are who you are, or you have chosen, you have stepped into that role which God himself prescribed? And because of that, we see Paul talking about, the first thing he says about in verse 21 is mutual submission. Husband and wife, which suggests that they're equal. All of them have an obligation not just to each other, but to God, and therefore they ought to submit to one another. So there is equality between husband and wife, not prescribed by culture or by law, but actually it derives from God himself, who created them in his own image. But it also gives us a certain order. We see the relationship between the church and Christ giving us as a mirror or as a paradigm of what marriage relationship are supposed to be. There's an order. There is the husband. Christ, as it were, is the head of the church. The order of, so that he has the priority in giving direction, in determining the way forward for the church. So also in the marriage, by God's will, the man is to provide leadership, is to provide guidance, is to be there, not as a Lord who just commands. Because here we're going to see what that involves. Of course, we've already talked about mutual submission, but he talks about Christ giving himself for the church. Why? In order to cleanse the church, in order to make it perfect, to make it radiant. The obligation of the husband is to nurture, to work to make his wife or his family better, to make it the best it can be. It is an image of self-sacrifice, self-giving. Love is self-giving. The husband loves his wife not as in expecting to be served, but as in giving himself to his wife, to make her the best she can be, to help her succeed, to help her be the kind of best person that she can be. That's what it means to lead or to be the head. And the submission from the wife is not as a servant or a servile type of submission, but it's a submission that has to do responding to the love that is given, responding to an environment in which you are accepted, you are loved, you are cherished. Therefore, you respond in submission because you know that the husband has your best interest for you. He's not out to hurt, he's not out to dominate you, but he's out to encourage and to lift you up. Now, which leads us now to the final bit of this kind of biblical model, which is that there are benefits, and the benefits are there's a mutual flourishing. Paul talks about he who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one has ever hated his own body. To love your wife is to do yourself a favor. Is to create an environment in which you yourself will flourish. By creating an environment in which your wife, your partner, or your wife flourishes, you are also creating an environment in which you will also feel comfortable, catered for, or cared for. So it's not what comes out of this passage is not so much as a ruler or a lord lording it over, or commanding and insisting on their own way, but as the one who loves and nurtures and creates an environment in which all will flourish. I believe that if we will adhere to this biblical model, to the high view of marriage as originating in God, and therefore that in the very first place, both husband and wife are obligated, have an obligation to God first before they even have obligation to each other. The calling to a high view of marriage. And I believe this is where the antidote today. This goes against, therefore, the selfishness, the self-centeredness, the kind of view where marriage is just for a show, in order to show that you're a respectable man or a respectable woman in society, but actually as a duty to God. This is the environment in which children are nurtured, are brought into being. That's why it's only after he's dealt with this that Paul then proceeds to deal with children, the obligation of parents and children, how they relate to each other. So may the Lord bless you. May the Lord help you as you use these principles. That marriage originates in God, and because of that, we all, husband and wife, have obligation to God first and foremost, to worship God, to obey God, to love God. God remains the standard. And therefore, mutual submission, because you are both servants of God, which is the implication of being creatures before God. And also, out of that then comes this whole self-sacrifice, the attitude of a husband working to make an environment better so that his wife can flourish, and in so doing he's doing himself a favor, creating an environment in which he himself will flourish. God bless you, and may you commit yourself to a high view of marriage.